Okay. I think we're going to have some people continuing to join us, but we've got a lot to get to today, and I want to get out of your way and hand it over to Sarah as quickly as possible. So, hello, everyone, and welcome to Mapping Your Leadership Development Journey with Sarah Drummond. I'm Kelly Morrissey, Managing Director of the Center for Continuing Education at Yale Divinity School. Thank you again for being with us. Megan Lukens, our Communications Coordinator, is also on with us today. Please feel free to reach out to Megan if you're having any technical issues with Zoom or if you have any questions. If you're new to the Center for Continuing Education, or if you're looking for other opportunities to learn or resources for ministry, I'd encourage you to visit our website, and we'll drop that link in the chat a little bit later. A quick note about how our session will work today. We will have some time for questions. As questions come up for you over the course of Sarah's talk, please post them directly in the chat to me, and I will help her manage those when the time comes. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. Sarah Drummond is the founding dean of Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School. She graduated from Yale College with a major in ethics, politics, and economics, Harvard Divinity School with a Master of Divinity, and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee with a PhD in urban education, specializing in administrative leadership. She is also an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. Sarah has served with Andover Newton since 2005, beginning as Director of Field Education and Assistant Professor of Ministerial Leadership. Her roles in the school changed numerous times, but her focus has always centered on administrative leadership, its study, its teaching, and its execution. By the time she was called to become Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School's founding dean, she was a tenured professor of ministerial leadership and had served as the dean of faculty since 2011. She played a central role in the school's becoming embedded at Yale Divinity School. Sarah writes about ministerial leadership with a special emphasis on how it's taught and learned. She's the author of 5 books, most recently, Intentional Leadership in Between Seasons, published by Pilgrim Press. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Megan, for your hospitality. I'm really excited about the content that we're going to be exploring, all of us together, over these 3 sessions, where we together will map out our own leadership development learning path forward. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation for today. So bear with me, please. I hope that you can see my screen. And I'm going to look. Hey, Virginia Child, give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Okay, all right. Thank you all for tuning in. I am going to be walking through a presentation, as I've mentioned. And if you would like to have the slides handy for this presentation, you'll see that they're available at our school's website. So if you go to andovernewton.yale.edu, /resources/lifelong learning, you'll see today's slide presentation. Kelly is going to be making these slides as well as recordings available to all of the people who've registered later in the process. But if you're one who wants to follow along on your own desktop, please feel free, and let us begin. You are here today at step 1 of your leadership development journey, your lifelong learning for leadership development journey. And I want to give a brief overview of what we'll cover in these 3 sessions so you can begin early to look ahead. I have the following 3 hopes for these 3 sessions. First, I hope that you embrace an attitude that might be a new attitude for you, where you understand that lifelong leadership learning, or LLL, is normal and necessary. So often as a seminary educator, especially one who teaches about leadership, I'll hear that joke of, nobody taught me this in grad school. Nobody taught me that in grad school, particularly around leadership questions. For example, conflict. Nobody told me that sometimes people get mad at each other even when they're good people. You know, you're probably right. We probably didn't. But lifelong leadership learning is normal. It's expected across fields that much of what we need to know about leadership comes gradually and over time. And the hope is that when people say, I can't believe you didn't already know that, you can say, well, believe it. I didn't already know that, but I am ready to learn. So that's the attitude I hope you emerge from this workshop embracing, if you don't already have it. Maybe some of you already do. Second, my hope is that people who participate are going to have the skill of making a plan, an intentional plan for leadership development that can become a healthy habit, where it's so ingrained in the way we look ahead to our responsibilities that developing the learning that we need in order to carry out what we're setting out to do just feels as normal as making sure we have enough time and money to do the things that we set out to do. And then finally, I'm hoping that you come out of this series with new knowledge, especially the knowledge that intentional balance among different forms of leadership learning is essential for any one of those areas to be successful. The three areas are learning about content, engaging in theological reflection or spiritual reflection or reflection, and then finally expanded horizons. I'll be making the argument that one needs to engage all of those forms of leadership development in a relatively balanced and choreographed way for any one of them to truly move us forward in our leadership capacities and skills and competencies and effectiveness. So again, attitude, skill, knowledge. So here's what we're going to do today. I have named 3 different styles, forms, strategies for developing ourselves as leaders. And those 3 are content, learning new content, reflective practice, and horizon expansion. Today, we're going to focus on the outcome of our attitude change and the topic of learning content, learning leadership content. So again, I've already shared that I'm really hoping that through this workshop, you come away understanding that what would be really weird would be leaders not needing lifelong learning. It's not just normal, it's not just natural, it is essential and it's to be expected. These times demand it. And the only question becomes, how do we approach it, not whether or not it's needed. So much of my presentation today actually will focus on the attitude of embracing that lifelong learning for leadership is just normal for anybody who has responsibility in an institution or over other people. And we will take less time to talk about how we learn using content, because again, the content, the reflective practice, and the horizon expansion all come together, fit together, and that will be the emphasis that we move into, those 3 different styles blending together. That's what we'll move into in the second and the third session. So without further ado, we want to find out who's here and what motivated them. Megan is going to administer a poll that actually uses language for the course description for the course that you're attending right now, because we want to get a better sense of what motivated you to be here today. So Megan, take it away. Please go ahead and complete the questions in this survey that have come up on your screen. Okay, thank you. Let's take a look. So the first question I invited you to reflect upon was, the training previously required of me to land my current leadership role was insufficient to the challenges I face today. And I asked you to say, does this resonate strongly or partly, or not at all, or it just has nothing to do with anything ever, Sarah? So it sounds like this resonated partly with many in the group. 55% say it resonates partly. So some of you feel like this doesn't really apply to your situation, or you felt like your prior training before you assumed the role you had was adequate. Okay, that's good. Next question. I can't read or keep track of what my constituents want or expect from me. Darn it. I added the darn it. That resonates partly, again, with many here, resonates partly. So the expectation question resonated partly. Third, I can't read or keep track of what my constituents want or expect from me. In this area, again, the partlies win, but there are many for whom this doesn't resonate. And that's actually good news, because unmanageable expectations are a ticket to burnout. And perhaps people who are that burned out just didn't even have it in them to sign up for this workshop. And then the final question, I want to be of best possible service to my community, but sometimes I feel overwhelmed and exhausted by my leadership roles demands. Well, I'm glad to hear that nobody says that this does not resonate, because we wouldn't choose this profession. I don't think we would choose this direction if we didn't want to be of best possible use and service. And for some of you, this resonates really strongly, that sometimes you feel overwhelmed and exhausted by the demands. If one wants to do a great job, perfectionism is not possible, but feeling like we've had an impact, of course, is something that we all crave and hunger. Megan, thank you so much for administering our poll. I think that we've got a sense that this is a group of people that feels like some things are going okay and wants to maybe build up a better toolbox. Shall I click the stop sharing? Will that make me unshare everything, Megan? I guess I click share results. That's what I'm doing. So, and now I'm going to close the poll. Okay, moving forward. So I promised you that we would spend some time talking about why an attitude that calls for lifelong learning for leadership is important. And I'm going to just share some of the reasons why the times demand that we do just that. The times demand that we are constantly refreshing our leadership capacities. So just a few markers of trends and issues that affect leaders today across fields. Now, my field, I focus on ministerial leadership, but no matter what kind of context you're serving in right now, I think these trends are going to look really familiar. First, and also as I'm rehearsing the different trends and issues that I'm seeing, I just encourage you to write into the chat what trends you're seeing, specifically ones that I'm missing. You'll have plenty of time to see what each other has written. Here are some that I think are pervasive. A membership decline. Across institutions, people do not want to sign their lives away. And when I say membership decline, we're seeing this in higher education, we're seeing this in religion, we're seeing that the only places where people want memberships have to do with one-way memberships, where they're getting, but they're not necessarily forming a mutual or reciprocal bond. So everybody wants the one-way kind of service where I get a membership where, I have a membership with BarkBox. I get dog toy of the month club at my house. And that kind of one-way doesn't feel like a big obligation, but the mutual covenantal kind, we're seeing decline anywhere someone has to put skin in the game. Second, individualism in information consumption. We might serve one community that is gathering its input as to how to think about what's happening around them from multiple different sources that they're able to curate without any mediator. What does that mean? That means that people can pick and choose, that they're only really getting one perspective. And there's no obligation for them to get multiple perspectives. Leading people who are making sense of the world in very different ways is more challenging than leading people who get all of their input about what's happening in the world from just a couple of sources. Many of us were raised in an era where there were 3 TV news channels and 1 local paper, and that was it. Obviously, we're in a time where people have to pick and choose. There's just too much material otherwise. Anti-Black racism, which has been among us for hundreds and hundreds of years, has been laid bare in new ways. So has systemic misogyny. Whereas forms of oppression used to, the oppressors used to be able to hide them and sneak them. Now, these are topics of conversation, ordinary conversation in educational, religious, and political settings. Does it mean that they're less nefarious? No, but it does mean that we're at a different point in our community building process, and leaders must be prepared for that, these difficult topics to come up at almost any juncture. We're seeing a pervasive loss of innocence as relates to institutions. I was a campus minister in my first many years in ministry, and I was pretty accustomed to people, even faculty members on the campus I served, having distrust for what they called organized religion. I'm also UCC, so the word organized never really felt like the right one. I come from a tradition of communal covenant, not so much organized. And yet I got really comfortable with people saying, I'm just not really sure how I feel about organized religion. Now I'm still in higher education, but I'm surrounded by a public that's not sure if they trust higher education. That would have baffled me 20 years ago. People trusted the university. They just didn't trust the church. Now they don't trust either. They just don't trust either. They don't trust anybody. That sense that no institution is too big to fail and that there's no blanket automatic trust is actually just incredibly understandable, given our access to information about the ways in which institutions have consolidated power unto the smallest most already privileged minority. That said, leaders have to work harder to earn trust than they ever have before. And that was not a leadership priority for which many leaders were prepared. Now, COVID intensified all of these trends, but none of them is new. And I think that it's important for us as we look through these trends and issues, and as you, I hope, add trends and issues to the chat over the next couple of slides, to bear in mind that COVID might have intensified them, but they were already there. The trends have accelerated. I call this the COVID accelerator. And we have no reason to think those trends are going to slow down now that COVID is not as prevalent among us. Why? Because people who write about futuristic leadership theories believe that acceleration is just the name of the game. That we used to be able to have a strategic plan that was for 10 years. Now we're saying 5. Now pretty soon it might be more like 2 or 3. We used to be able to say we're going to imagine a 7-year contract for a senior executive leader or a 5-year contract. Now 5 and 7 years are longer than the average tenure of the senior executive leaders in universities and are right at the average tenure of senior ministers. So acceleration is the name of the game. There's no reason to think that the downhill momentum is suddenly going to level off. Now, some of this acceleration, some of these trends are really, really good, especially for faith communities. What are some examples of good things? So first, in this time of rapid cultural change, we're seeing quickly growing acceptance that people are different from each other, that gender is fluid, that race matters, that prejudice and privilege exist. It really was not that long ago where institutions would have been really reluctant to say any of those statements out loud. And now those statements are not everywhere, but they're much more common, much more acceptable as just a commonly held set of assumptions. Second, especially during and immediately after COVID, we see just a greater appreciation for the damage that can be done to our souls through isolation. Loneliness and burnout are now recognized as mental health crises. That might not have been possible if we hadn't been plunged collectively into isolation for such a protracted period of time as what COVID imposed on us. And I do believe that even the students that I work with here at Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School come in with a higher premium placed on building community than I might have seen before the pandemic. And when I and my colleagues here at Andover Newton put out there that building community is a core competency for ministry, people nod. They don't wonder. They don't have follow-up questions. They understand that it's just fundamentally true. And finally, the acceleration of change that we've seen in what's expected of leaders, the leadership landscape on which they function, is that old definitions of success are understood to be up for grabs, up for re-examination in ways that was surely long overdue. The Great Resignation and the way it touched not just industry, where the job market is really good, but touched ministry, touched higher education, I think was a real wake-up call that in the midst of a pretty strong job market, people who are miserable and are constantly told they're not being successful the way they're supposed to be, just leave. And that gets people's attention. Second, this concept of self-care that we talk about in ministry, but are somehow kind of glorified when we don't do it. Like we are called harder workers when we're not taking good care of ourselves. I feel like that's really beginning to melt away. I certainly take my own self-care, and the people in my care, I take their self-care much more seriously, because I think the stakes have been better understood to be much higher than we might have thought. So this was the big aha moment for me. I and my colleagues spent a lot of time this summer traveling to denominational biennials, both the key traditions that Andover Newton serves, the American Baptist Churches USA and the United Church of Christ, had their biennials, and they were right back to back. And something I discovered while I was traveling was this. In the past, when I would say in settings like those, things like, I don't know, the old ways of leading don't work anymore, or the old ways of developing leadership skills, attitudes, and knowledge, those aren't working either. And that's not an indicator that anybody failed anybody. I found I was able to say those things without seeing puzzlement, without receiving resistance, and in fact, with a just much warmer welcome. When I first was called to serve Andover Newton, that would not have happened, because I think, first of all, the fear factor of what if the truth is that we're doing this all wrong? It's amazing what we can deny when we are afraid that we're failing, but we don't see any alternative. Now, I think we're at a point where the failure, whether it happened or not, is kind of back there with the end of Christendom. So I think people are more ready to say the old ways are not working. What could work? And that openness, I think, is a wonderful invitation for all of us. So this season, this current season, is a season of reimagining what leadership is and how we learn how to do it. We're seeing this great untethering take place, where individuals are less specifically tethered to a particular faith tradition, specifically a particular church. We see ways in which churches are less tethered to denominations. And that untethering requires a different kind of leadership than a membership-based organization might need. Is that a bad thing, a good thing? It doesn't matter. It's just what's happening. So we need to think about, well, what does leadership look like in a season of untethered commitment? And we are not going to be the first ones to have to ask that question. Back in the 1970s and 80s, Orlando Costas, who was the academic dean at Andover Newton Theological School, and a very important writer on the topic of missions, wrote this book that I just kind of fell back in love with this past summer. The book is called Christ Outside the Gate. And the premise behind the book is that Jesus never meant for religion to take place within the temple. Religion was meant, according to Jesus's ministry, to be taking place outside the gate with people at the margins. And the idea of being a Christian really was to join Jesus in serving those at the margins. He didn't go so far as to say the church got this completely wrong and we need to rethink everything. But when one reads between the lines, one sees that this whole concept that the untethered style is not new at all. It's just that it was outlier voices previously that were predicting that this is where we would land, where we would find ourselves at a time where the temple walled structure was no longer something to which people were willing to buy in. So how am I supposed to lead amidst this untethering? You said we need something new. So what the heck is it? I'm going to make an attempt at some guiding principles for what leadership looks like amidst this great untethering. So there's some really good leadership theory already out there today. And although what I'm presenting to you in these sessions, much of it is new and original, it's actually going into a book that I'm working on now. I also rely on a lot of others who are writing at this time. So I invite you, just as I invited you to write into the chat, actually, I'm going to do that next, sorry. So leadership theory today, big concepts that are emerging from a number of different sources at the same time. One of those concepts is debunking what some in leadership theory called ladder theories of progress. So ladder theories of progress are any definition, like kind of step-by-step definition of you go from failure to success through these easy steps. Well, we can't really agree on what success looks like, can we? We can't really say that we're going to build a theory of leadership that gets us from here to there when we don't even know where here is. So ideas of leadership success that have to do with one-dimensional movement, like the line that goes just in one direction, are being deemed just unhelpful and insufficient because they are unhelpful and insufficient. Second, great man style leadership development. Now, I, for one, love going to listen to the inspirational stories of leaders. Some of the best books that I've read about leadership are books that are like biographies of really tremendous leaders. That said, great man style leadership development, where there's a whole leadership course built on bringing in successful people and having them tell their story, are just not having a real influence on people's capacity as leaders. We're not seeing the growth that one might hope in a leadership development program of hearing stories from great men. Does this mean that I don't find those stories really fascinating and wonderful? No, not at all. Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on leadership that profiles 5 leaders, I read the whole thing and then went back to page 1 and read it all again because it was so good. It just probably didn't make me a better leader. There wasn't a really strong correlation there. The new models that are emerging for describing a different perspective on success and a different perspective on movement include some really good authors and resources. So in the chat, I'd love you to share your recommendations for leadership books that have helped you. I'm going to name just 3 that should give you a sense of the kinds of things people are thinking and talking and writing about. So Susan Beaumont, goddess, I worship the ground she walks on. Susan Beaumont wrote this wonderful book, among many wonderful books, called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. And in that book, she introduces the idea that we need to create an incubator atmosphere for what is emerging in leadership without permitting our communities and our care to fall back on old ways or rush ahead into directions that they don't really understand yet. So that premature foreclosure that would make us feel better, saying, "Up, I've got the answer, we're done." So tantalizing, but we're not there yet. We're not ready yet. So Susan's book had a big influence on me, and I really recommend anything she's written previously as well. Now, Alan Roxburgh, totally different school of thought. Alan Roxburgh is still writing and wrote a great deal about what was called the New Missions Movement or the missional church movement back in the early 2000s. And lots of parts of that movement had an influence on the church, and a lot of parts of it just did not get off the ground. So his writing is both a reflection on why the missional church movement didn't get off the ground, but also what might be a more worthy approach now. To make a very long story short, Roxburgh writes that we follow God out into the neighborhood. We don't draw people toward God in our churches. And although that seems like a subtle shift, it does involve movement in a different kind of direction. And I find his writing to be quite therapeutic, because sometimes I do think that the reason everything is unraveling when it comes to church as I once knew it, institutions that are important to me, that are really struggling to figure out this reality, darn it if I don't feel like it's all my fault. And Roxburgh helps me to understand that maybe I need to join God in the great unraveling rather than resist and lock up out of fear that somebody's going to tell me that I ended Christendom with my bare hands. Finally, I'm recommending this book, Being Together a Different Way, about how to be together in a different way. So Another Way by Steve Lewis and Matthew Williams and Dory Baker explores the idea that maybe the first step toward leading in a different way is going to be in the most microcosmic settings, being together in a different way. And they present this theory that it's in these small cells, CLL, like the organismal cell, that the real change happens. And they present all of these different ideas for being together differently. And I've found great inspiration in them. Okay, so Kelly mentioned my most recent book, which is called Intentional Leadership in Between Seasons. So intentional leadership came for me out of inspiration, where is this in Susan Beaumont's book, How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. She writes that we can't allow communities, I'm going to repeat myself, but it's kind of a mouthful. Susan writes that we can't allow our communities to backslide into old ways when they're anxious, but we also can't let them rush to premature closure when they're just not ready yet. So her admonition is that we need to help our communities to stay put and stay open to what God is telling them. And she writes, for example, about how sometimes you need to agitate them a little bit over here, but then you need to console them over there. But I felt like I wanted much more. I felt like Susan was saying, Sarah, look busy so your community doesn't think you're not doing anything, but then don't make them rush ahead. And I really just didn't know how to do that. Rushing is my chosen mode. So I wrote this book to present a possibility for what might that kind of staying put look like that remains quite engaged. And so I shared in the book, I'm just going to run through them very quickly. I shared these 5 different tensions. And in the tensions, you can see here, they're meant to counterbalance one another. So I can ask myself, like, I can't be sure if I did a good job or a bad job, but I can ask myself, am I adequately balancing attention to individuals with attention to the whole community? I might have a sense the whole community is doing great, but what about those 1 or 2 people who seem like they're maybe kind of hanging off the edge. I can ask myself questions of, am I being adequately inclusive without pretending that my school can be all things to all people? That's where we get to the inclusivity versus clear identity. So you see in the top right, an image of how a sewing machine works. So sewing machines work in part because they've got thread coming from the bottom and thread coming from the top at the same time. And if you've ever broken a sewing machine, you know that getting the tension just right is actually pretty difficult. And once you get the tension just right, you can find that right kind of balance. So what I propose in my book is that it's not about getting to a goal. When you're sewing on a sewing machine, you can sew in curlicues, you can sew all different kinds of patterns because you're not holding your tension this way like a plumb line. You're holding it in balance in real life, real time, day to day. So what I've given you so far is a backdrop for why I want you to tell everybody that you know when they say, why are you doing a leadership development course? You're going to say something, well, everybody should, because it's a jungle out there. Everything's changing all the time, and all these people are counting on me. So of course. So I hope that so far I've been able to persuade you that of course, we need leadership development. We need new ideas about what leadership is and needs to be, what we need to do to be ready for it. So I'm now going to move into the first of our three different approaches. And it's one that's going to sound so self-evident to you that you're going to wonder why it needs to be isolated out. And I think, again, that will become more clear over these three sessions. So the first area we're going to explore is content-oriented lifelong learning for leadership. Imagine that you have stumbled upon a possibility whose requirements of you are not fully in hand, something that would be a great thing for your community to embrace under your leadership, but there's a whole lot about it that you don't know. A reasonable person will say, there's certain things that you can do to become more familiar. You don't need to say, oh, we can't do that because I don't know how. You can say, I'm going to have to do some background research. And what might be available to you could be books and articles, courses of study like the one you're taking right now, or experts with whom you could consult. It might sound really easy, but it's the intentionality that most often gets lost in the shuffle. So first, the tendency to go fishing. Many of you, I'm sure, have written down in the chat, I can't really see everything at once, but I'm trusting that you've written in the chat some great leadership books. And my hope for you is that you've jotted many of them down. It's not my hope that you're just going to go fishing in them, because the hope is that you're going to be selective, reading about the dimensions of leadership that you need to know right now, that you need to know based on the challenge that's in front of you. So often somebody will come up to me and say, you really should read this book. And I know that that's a nice thing. Like they're saying that because they're wanting to be helpful. But my advice to you is thank them and then don't. Write it down. If you really trust the person, write it down. But if we allow all of our content-based learning to come at us, irrespective of where our struggles are, we're just going to become overwhelmed. We need to be more targeted because there is just too much good stuff out there. Plus, there's a whole lot of garbage out there. Second, when it comes to choosing the inputs that we're going to gather, many of us make the mistake of getting the input without any strategy for how we're going to capture what we learn. Let me give an example. I use bibliographical software, and I use it pretty religiously and for a lot of resources that might not leap to the eye. When I read a book, I take the book and I write my notes and my quotes into EndNote, along with all the bibliographical information. I then put the book away and I never touch it again. Why? Because I have all my notes in EndNote. And unless I just want to hold it up because it's pretty, there's really nothing else that I need from that book. If I don't go through that ritual, two things happen. One is that I don't have the reference really handy, so I don't cite it. I don't grab it because it's just too inconvenient to go back to the actual text. Second, I am quite sure that cognitively, for me, capturing material helps me to digest it, helps me to integrate it into my work and my practice. Some of you might be familiar with the time management system called Getting Things Done. It's a system that has been super simple. It's basically a fancy way of saying write everything down. But the premise, the neurological premise behind the system of getting things done is that if we don't have a good way to capture our ideas, our new ideas, our brain will stop giving them to us. Our brains are very efficient. They don't throw good money after bad. So if we're not taking our resources that we gather and putting them someplace and putting them to work, we might lose our aptitudes for gathering new information and creating new ideas. And finally, coming back to that whole when people recommend you a book, one of the truisms of research is that the question drives the method. You don't say, I want to put out a survey. You don't say, I want to interview people. You say, I have a question. And then you articulate your question very clearly, like as clearly as you can. And only then do you develop a strategy for a survey or an interview or a focus group or any other style. Now, this is something that anybody who's done research knows can make you crazy. If you decide on your method before you know your question, it's really hard to figure out what your question ever was because you kind of fall in love with the method. And you interview people and you talk about everything but what the question might have been because they're interesting. Similarly, when it comes to developing content, when you think about the content that you need to learn to be an effective leader, the best starting point is a question. And then it's good discipline to gather resources that are pertinent toward that question, not just fishing around. Because again, you'll become overwhelmed, you'll become super saturated, and you will feel the overwhelm that this mini course is meant to help prevent. So I'm going to give an example in just a moment. And first, I'm going to point out the 3 different practices that I associate with having a good question and getting it answered. Whenever I encounter something in my work that feels like it's just outside my area of not even expertise, but just like any clue whatsoever, I ask these 3 questions. What are the how-tos? What are the how-tos? What might I read about how a person does this? Second, I ask the question, how are others handling the same thing? How are peers and colleagues handling the same thing? And then finally, I ask the question, yeah, it's great what the peers are doing. It's great that these are the best recommended practices, sure. But what about this context? Is there something special or different about this context that neither of those sources could possibly have identified? Instead of just going out and finding books and seeking out courses and finding expert consulting partners, I start with my own question. Now, the question I wanted to use as an example of, imagine you're serving a faith community and you've heard tell that some faith communities spin off nonprofits so they can serve their communities in a different way, perhaps using grants, perhaps serving a different constituency than they're used to. And I might think to myself, that sounds like a really neat idea, but I really haven't a clue what that is or what that means. So there are plenty of resources available for those who wish to learn about how to start a nonprofit. There are websites, there's like an idiot's guide equivalent. So I might go find some articles or some books to read about how does one start a new nonprofit. Then I might ask around, who do you know, colleagues and friends, whose church did this? Because they might be able to save me a lot of time. And then third, I test my own context to say, hey, I've been reading this stuff and I've been chatting with these folks. do you think that there is an appetite in this community for this kind of conversation? Again, this might all seem so intuitive, and yet very few leaders approach this kind of work with the kind of intentionality that I think these days call for. These days of overwhelm, these days of more content than we could ever know how to handle. So, so forgive this slide if it seems like it's got a flair for the obvious, but I think that what you might find is that it's the intentionality piece where things start getting really interesting. So I've offered a bibliography here of the resources that I have cited in this presentation. And early in the presentation, I gave you the website where you could find this now. And if you're willing to wait until Kelly sends these slides later, you can wait too. But I'm now going to stop my share and turn to my colleague, Kelly, to see if anybody had any questions at all, or if I was just so thorough that you all just want to go eat your sandwich.
Well, I did remind everybody to drop any questions into the chat. I am wondering, Sarah, that this is a lot of information, right?
Sure.
And helpful for I'm trying to just take in all of the information that you gave us and figure out how to process it. But you know, April says that she would love to hear you talk a little bit more about tension, like the tension sewing machine analogy, and how you really have to navigate that as a leader.
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. So, April, I wrote a whole book about that topic, so you can imagine that it's hard to give it sound bites. But the idea behind the book, the idea behind intentional leadership, is that so many of us were enculturated to understand leadership in a goal-oriented way. So a goal-oriented way might best be imagined as a plumb line, as a plumb line where we're pulling our way toward a goal. And we're just not in the sort of time where that style of leadership is always appropriate. Why? Because we don't know necessarily what the goal should be, because we might find that the goals that we always had before, there was no there. They weren't realistic. And I do believe that that's appropriate on this side of the kingdom of heaven. The fact is that we live in a world that's never going to be precisely and fully what God imagines it to be until Jesus comes again, or until the other side of the veil, or until kingdom come, however your faith tradition teaches you. So we're all just trying our best. Sometimes by a goal orientation, we end up losing track of the people around us. So for instance, many suffer, I actually wrote my blog last week about many suffer from terrible self-esteem issues when membership declines in their community. And that's going to happen if your goal was grow in membership. That will happen, that you're going to feel very disheartened. But if we looked at a different perspective of saying what we're really trying to do is find the right kind of balance, again, I cited finding the right kind of balance between care for the whole community and care for the individuals in the community. We can actually be good at that. We can actually say, you know what, I feel like I'm doing a good job creating a good atmosphere with this community. And I do feel like I'm dedicating significant attention to the individuals as well. Is that a goal? Is that not a goal? Well, it's certainly a lot more rich than how many tushies were in the pew on Sunday. Not that that doesn't matter. It's a data point, and data points do matter. But there's a big difference between a data point and a success story. So in intentional leadership, I flesh this out much, much more. But that's just kind of a quick assessment of why an intentional leadership, using the sewing machine metaphor, is different from a ladder theory of progress, or from a plumb line understanding of how we formulate our goals.
Okay. Sarah, could you talk a little bit about what the current climate or the current theologies about leadership mean for emerging leaders, folks who are in their 20s or 30s who are just starting their leadership journey?
Sure. I hear emerging differently from just graduating into. So I'm going to talk about just graduating into, or just endeavoring to start the study process to graduate into. But if people have questions about emergent or emerging leadership, that's totally my jam. I'm really into that. So, but I'm not going to answer that question. Here's the thing. People ask me all the time, so Sarah, you've got these students coming to Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School, and isn't it wonderful that they still want to be pastors? Like, people still want to be pastors. No, they don't. They really don't. What we hear is students saying that they want to be ministers in the way that I want the church to be. But when they are talking about the institution of the church, they're quite ambivalent about it, actually. But here's the good news. The kind of ministry that God appears, in my anecdotal subset, appears to be calling people to are ministries of social justice, ministries of healing, ministries of meaning making, ministries of care. And my hope is that that is the direction the church of the future can go, particularly if we take people like Orlando Costas seriously and understand ministry at the margins, that our role as Christians is to join Jesus in ministry, not create an institution that then needs to be tended. So again, I think that those who are emerging into ministry do very well to, and I say this to them every day, and if any of them are on the screen, they'll be able to mouth along with me, that you got to be ready for anything. You come here to seminary because we're trying to fill that backpack with readiness to serve a church, to serve in a hospital, to serve in a school, to serve in a nonprofit. And you need to be ready to serve the church as it is and as it's becoming. So the primary education for them is built around competencies that they need to embrace with a great deal of nimbleness, because the church into which they graduate is not going to be the same as it is right now. Change is happening that fast.
Another question, how do you see the tension between management and leadership? A lot of times clergy get caught up with the million tasks of church management. How do they make space for leadership?
Those two tasks are absolutely intertwined. So the way some break down the different roles that a leader needs to choreograph, sometimes juggle, is leadership, management, and administration. So leadership has everything to do with setting a vision and working with a community to figure out what is it that we're here to be and become. The kind of words you hear is like what's our mission? What's our vision? And that's the work of leadership, is coming to some semblance of clarity about why the institution exists. Management is about the coordination of the different constituents toward that vision, toward the enacting of that vision. And administration is that I used that word earlier, capturing the steps that we've taken, communicating with each other. Capture and communication are mostly what administrators do. I fear sometimes that leaders get this idea that the vision stuff is important and the administration stuff is not important. But the thing is, they really do depend on each other. You could be the greatest visionary in the world, but if you never return a phone call, you can't delegate work to the community so that they could share in the enacting of that vision. So again, they're all quite intertwined. And I think that a clear mission, a clear sense of this is who we are and this is who we aren't, helps us make good choices about management and administration. I don't know about you, but if I don't know the mission, I don't know when to say yes and when to say no. If I don't have a strategic plan, I just want to be all things to all people. And I end up administratively and managerially completely snowed under.
Yeah, we have another question that's kind of similar, but maybe I can phrase it for you this way. So totally agree that you need to have a mission, you need to have a stated mission that everyone is working towards, looking at everything that you're doing and making sure that it is in service of the mission. We all know that Administrivia has a gravitational pull though, right?
Yeah, of
It has a pull because you can't ignore it always, or you can't put it off. And
course.
sometimes it's easier to do those things and like check them off, right?
Mhm.
Versus kind of tackling the bigger issues of planning ahead or that type of thing. Do you have any suggestions for pastors out there, or this one who asks in particular, about how to kind of manage that?
Sure. I think that so I wrote this book called Sharing Leadership, and the subtitle is A United Church of Christ Way of Being in Community. And in that book, I write about what it means to be an administrator, manager, and leader in a setting where leadership is shared and where hierarchies are flat. Now, in settings like that, the most important visioning work sometimes takes the form of role clarification. Where I find myself, and I see my colleagues really overwhelmed, is where everything is a committee of the whole. And for that reason, we're in meetings a lot, we're in group emails a lot, and we're overwhelmed by cross-checking and permission seeking instead of making progress toward the goal. So the first piece of advice, I give this in the book, and I give this to you all now, is that when you feel overwhelmed by Administrivia, take a big step back into the question of, is this my role? And is my role am I stewarding that role properly based on the mission and the mission and the strategic plan and the vision of this institution? Am I stewarding it well? And most of the time, I feel like if the role is okay, you can use the content of a good book on time management. You can use the content of finding colleagues who have really good systems for how they keep track of everything, get their counsel, get their advice. But I think role confusion will just make it impossible to even begin to organize, because what you're then organizing shouldn't be something that you're organizing into your schedule because it wasn't yours. I think we might be at time, Kelly.
We are at time. We want to respect everyone's time here. We know you've got other things to go off to, but we will be sending out an email this week, as Sarah said, with a link to the recording of today's session, as well as a link to Andover Newton's site where you can get the slides, or you can go visit their site and get it if you want it sooner than that. And the Zoom link will be the same every week, but we'll send out a reminder and it will have the link in it as well. So if anybody has any questions or there's anything you need, feel free to reach out to Megan or I, but we look forward to seeing everybody back next week.
And also, can I just say a word, Kelly, about next week?
Yeah.
So next week, I saw in the chat that I don't mean to interrupt, but I did notice in the chat, people were wondering about getting together. Next week, you will be spending some time in small groups because we're talking about reflective practice. So just bear in mind that you will be in small group work next time. And I hope that if you feel energized by that you might continue in that reflective practice between those sessions 2 and 3. Thanks, Kelly.
Great. Thank you, everyone.